and welcome to The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. The 60th anniversary of the Beatles' legendary performance at the Hollywood Bowl was just a couple of days ago on August 23rd, 2024. Why is that date so special? Has there ever been a group of fans who've hung on for this long? We'll have to wait and see, a long time to see, but Taylor Swift's fans may give them a run for their money. Truthfully, there's no denying that it was a pivotal moment for both the band and the history of rock and roll, solidifying the Beatles' rapid rise and status as global superstars. Beatlemania took hold in the U.S. against the backdrop of a nation in mourning following the November 1963 assassination of JFK. Joining us now to discuss the role of the Beatles in the 1960s counterculture movement and how they went from being relatively unknowns in the U.S. in 1963 to global icons in 1964 is music historian and Beatles scholar Martin Lewis. Martin, thanks for joining me on The Excerpt.
My great pleasure.
I want to discuss the 1964 Hollywood Bowl concert, but let's start with an equally iconic moment that happened in February of the same year, the Beatles' first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Can you describe what would later be considered the beginning of the British invasion?
What happened was that the Beatles had improbably become very successful in their own country in the year 1963. I say improbable because they came from a small provincial town and suddenly took over the whole of Britain and indeed Europe. And their manager, Brian Epstein, had an ambition, as did they, to conquer the United States, which was a ludicrous ambition because British pop music wasn't successful in America. It just didn't happen. But the Beatles were something special, and their manager embarked on this amazing campaign to get them to be successful in America. And one of the ways he did it was he approached Ed Sullivan, who was the legendary TV host of a weekly show that used to get about 14 or 15 million viewers a week. And he persuaded Ed Sullivan to put the Beatles on. And what happened, however, was that the point at which the Beatles went on, 73 million people tuned in to watch them that week, which was a record. How that happened was amazing.
Martin, that appearance was, of course, long before the 1980s when MTV brought a wide variety of music into everyone's living room. Was this must-see TV at the time, as you've described, and did this moment mark a generational shift in pop culture?
It really was an incredible shift in pop culture when the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan. Ed Sullivan had been going since the late 40s, early 50s, and at that time there was usually one television in the house and the family watched together. And Ed Sullivan would put on what we would really call a variety show. It was a mixture, so there'd be old-style crooners, there'd be jugglers, fire swallowers, and just a general, and puppets. And occasionally he would put on pop artists. He famously put on Elvis Presley, and that brought in the youngsters. But it was family viewing. But when the Beatles went on Ed Sullivan, suddenly it was an earthquake. It made a huge impact. And the reason why so many people watched that week was because the Beatles had exploded in the previous 45 days. And suddenly the whole of America watched. That was over 40% of the American population watching at a single time. Of course, now everything's diversified because we all have our own televisions, our own tablets, our own phones. But at those days, everything was singular. You were just one family around a television set, and the Beatles made history that time.
Let's turn now to the Beatles' first performance at the Hollywood Bowl in 1964. What was happening in the American music scene during that time?
Most entertainers, be they on TV or stage, had a kind of plastic Las Vegas smile about them. You know, we're entertainers. The Beatles had none of that. The Beatles were just giddy and optimistic and exuberant with their own energy of their enjoyment of music. And that conveyed itself to the audience. There was authenticity. And the fans related to that the Beatles weren't manufactured. When they took the stage at the Hollywood Bowl, the fan reaction was incredible. Couldn't actually hear the music because the fans, majority of them girls, were screaming so loud. Of course, later the Beatles became louder than the screams, but at that time the electronic equipment was limited and could not be louder than the screams.
I read that it took less than 4 hours for the 1964 Hollywood Bowl concert to sell out. At that time, if you wanted to go to a concert, you had to go out and buy a physical ticket. What role did the Beatles record label, their manager, Brian Epstein, play in that show selling out so quickly, and just the overall rapid success of the Beatles?
What was remarkable about the Beatles' success in this pre-internet era was that it was word of mouth and it was enthusiasm. On Christmas Day 1963, practically nobody in America had heard of the Beatles, and yet by the time of the Ed Sullivan Show 45 days later, 73 million people tuned in. How did that happen? Well, it was a variety of circumstances, but it was triggered mainly by their manager, Brian Epstein. Having secured a contract for them to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show at a time they didn't even have a record contract in America, he went about convincing Capitol Records to sign the Beatles, and he did that by saying, hey, I've got them on the Ed Sullivan Show, at which point they said, oh, well, if you've got them on the Ed Sullivan Show, we better put the record out. And then the record was released in the Christmas vacation. It was released on the day after Christmas, which was crucial because kids were at home. If you think of the wonderful enthusiasm for Taylor Swift, a terrific artist, it was like that times 100 million. No disrespect to Taylor Swift and her incredible fans, but the electricity of the Beatles and their success without the internet was astonishing.
As you mentioned, with that concert, the fans were screaming so loudly that you could barely hear the music. That hysteria faded decades ago, but the Beatles' music still endures. Do you think the latter would surprise the Fab Four of 1964?
It would have surprised the Beatles to know that their music would last that long, but in a sense, if we take a broader perspective, it shouldn't surprise us. That is because we have grown up in the last 100 years to think of things as being all about the now, but it shouldn't be about when something is created. It should be about how good it is. For example, we don't say, oh, that's Shakespeare. Gosh, he's 400 years old. We don't want any of his plays. Or we don't say about the Marx Brothers, oh, it's so 1930s. It's not funny. You shouldn't judge art and entertainment by when it was created. It's just either good or it's not good. And what the Beatles did was timeless because it was authentic and it connected with the noblest part of the human spirit, which is the part that yearns to make itself and the world a better place. It was of life itself. And so each generation rediscovers the Beatles and says, wow, this stuff's fantastic. And spoiler alert, it is.
I mentioned the enduring nature of the Beatles' music. The songwriting team of John Lennon and Paul McCartney led to an evolution of the rock and roll sound of the 1960s and beyond. What did each of them individually bring to the Beatles' distinct sound?
What was unique about the Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney as songwriters and later George Harrison, was that up until the Beatles, in popular music, what most artists did was they got better at doing the same thing. You played guitar better, you sang better, your lyrics were a little more interesting. The Beatles instinctively threw out those rules. They weren't interested just in getting a little better. They were interested in expanding the horizons, changing the boundaries of what you could do. So their melodies became much more fascinating, their rhythms, their harmonies. If you listen to early rock and roll, which was very good with the foundation stones, if you like, of popular music, it's primitive. It's effective, but it's primitive. It's like everything was in black and white and they were doing 3D Technicolor. They were doing things on a horizon that no one had imagined before.
As the band evolved, how did they come to represent the counterculture movement of that time?
Popular artists weren't expected to have views on politics or social matters. They weren't. They were just there to smile and wave. And, if they became successful, buy their mum and dad a nice house. That's what you did. You certainly didn't have opinions. But the Beatles were all very strong-minded, intelligent people, especially John Lennon. He had a curiosity, an intellectual curiosity about the world around him. He read books voraciously and he consumed news. So he started writing songs that reflected that and talked about what was going on in the world. And they started talking in their interviews. John Lennon in particular, the Vietnam War was distressing to him. And the Beatles were absolutely outraged when they found there was a thing called segregation. On their first tour in 1964, 60 years ago, there were concerts taking place, and originally the audience was going to be segregated, black and white, separate parts of the theatre. The Beatles were outraged and said, no, we will not accept that. We only will play if an audience is integrated.
Well, a notable moment that we all just saw recently was, of course, at the Olympics, where John Lennon's Imagine took center stage once again at the opening ceremonies. I did want to ask before we wrap up, as fans both old and new look back on the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' first concert at the Hollywood Bowl and Beatlemania, what is Beatles must-see TV today? What will you be watching or listening to commemorate this moment?
The Beatles created a huge amount of music in just 7 short years as recording artists. But the one song that I will be listening to that says it all is the song that they recorded and performed live to the world in 1967 called All You Need Is Love. And there's an interesting story behind it. John Lennon and Paul McCartney met for the first time in July of 1957. And at the time, John was playing with his schoolmates in a church garden party, and there were about 400 people there. And Paul McCartney was one of them. Almost 10 years later, to the day, John and Paul, together with George and Ringo, perform in front of 400 million people, 400 million people live on the world's first ever satellite link-up. It was the first time it ever happened, and the Beatles were chosen to be ambassadors for Britain. And they performed this song written specially by John Lennon for the occasion called All You Need Is Love. And it was an anthem. It's a message for the ages. It's a message to all of us to look to our better angels, to make the world a better place. Not easy to do, but it's an aspiration. And so when you listen to All You Need Is Love, you hear the Beatles giving us a message. They're passing the torch to us, and we in turn pass it on to the next generation. That's the message for the ages. All you need is love. Of course, we need a bit more than that, but love is a start.
Martin, thank you so much for joining me on The Excerpt.
Pleasure.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.